This is part 5 on the Power and the People course, and I'm going to split this topic into 2 different videos. And the first, we will cover the causes of the English Civil War. So let's start with a bit of background knowledge. If you watched the last video on Henry VIII and the Pilgrimage of Grace, you will remember the English Reformation, where England began its transition from being a Catholic to a Protestant country, with the king being the head of the Church of England. So now we're going to look at 100 years after Henry broke away from Rome, and it has been a very long and very bloody struggle between Catholics and Protestants in England. But now Protestants are the dominant force in the country. If you have a spectrum from Catholics to Protestants, the most radical Protestant groups, such as the Puritans, Quakers or Baptists, are now some of the country's wealthiest and most powerful families. You also have a new royal line, as Henry VIII's daughter Elizabeth died without any heirs, and so we now have a royal line with the Stuarts, as James I became the first king of England, Ireland and Scotland. When James died in 1625, his son Charles took over, and his reign saw the most serious threat that the English monarchy has ever faced, resulting in the country descending into civil war and the execution of the king. But in order to understand why this happened, we need to understand the causes of the English Civil War. First, we see politics as a major factor, because at the core of this conflict is a clash between the king and parliament. Charles strongly believed in the divine rights of kings, which meant that he alone was handpicked by God to rule, and that parliament should never restrain his authority. From some of his earliest surviving letters, they reveal a deep distrust in the House of Commons, and Parliament was worried about the king's attempts to bypass its authority. And a few years into Charles's reign, they presented him with a petition of right, insisting that the king addressed Parliament's concerns. Charles reacted to this by dissolving Parliament in 1629, which would not be called for another 11 years. Some would call these years the personal rule of King Charles, whilst others, a bit more critical of the king, labelled it as the 11 years of tyranny. So with Parliament out of the picture, we also see finances as a grievance against Charles. Typically, Parliament was meant to approve of taxes being levied, but as they were out of the picture, Charles decided to raise funds himself through a tax called ship money. This was a tax typically on coastal communities to pay for navy and protection during times of war. In 1635, this tax was extended not only from coastal regions, but also inland. Paying for coastal protection made absolutely no sense if you lived in the middle of England, and considering the country was at peace, this tax was deeply unpopular. In 1637, an MP named John Hampden was put on trial for refusing to pay ship money and gain national attention. As Charles's authority was being challenged, tax avoidance became commonplace. Hampden would later go down to be one of the leading voices against Charles in Parliament. Next, we have religion. England was a Protestant country, and there was a massive anti-Catholic feeling in England, especially after the gunpowder plot of 1605, in which Catholics tried to assassinate the king. But Charles made some decisions that started to raise a few eyebrows. For example, he married a Catholic, Henrietta Maria of France, and also allowed Catholic priests in court. Most significantly, Charles appointed William Laud as the Archbishop of Canterbury, and he introduced many aspects of Catholic worship to the Church of England, such as elaborately decorated churches. Charles and Laud worked together to remodel the church, including a new book of common prayer, which was slightly Catholic looking. Although Charles was actually a Protestant, rumours were going round that he was a bit sympathetic towards the Catholics, or may even be one himself, which weakened the trust in the king. So this new Catholic-looking prayer book was imposed on Scotland, and they did not like it, leading to war as another major factor. These religious changes provoked a wave of riots, and the Scots signed something called a National Covenant, which is basically a promise pledging to defend their religion from changes and the immediate withdrawal of the prayer book. Well, Charles did not back down and sent an army to crush the rebels. As the Bishops' War broke out with Scotland, the rebels invaded England, and Charles had run out of money, and he only had one place to turn to. So, after 11 years, Charles calls back his parliament in 1640. The House of Commons told Charles that they were willing to give him the money to fight this war, but only if he would give in to some concessions, such as reversing Laud's religious changes and promising not to pass any new laws without Parliament. Charles refused to accept these terms and dissolved Parliament after only 3 weeks, which is why we call this the Short Parliament. A few months later, Scotland invaded again, and Charles had to recall Parliament again. This one was called the Long Parliament because unintentionally it lasted for 20 years, making it the longest lasting parliament in British history. Now, the long parliament makes even more demands to Charles, and to be fair to him, he does agree to some, but not all, and deep distrust remained. Things were frosty between the king and the parliament, and at the end of 1641, Parliament passed the Grand Remonstrance, which was basically a long list of 204 reasons why the king is awful. This said things like he ignores Parliament, he was corrupt, he was too nice to Catholics, and he appointed terrible advisors. It showed that the trust between the king and Parliament had completely collapsed, and this was the breaking point. And so, Charles marched into Parliament with armed men in January 1642 to arrest the 5 ringleaders of the opposition. This confirmed every suspicion that Parliament had of Charles as a tyrannical ruler. Knowing what was about to happen, Charles travelled to Nottingham and called all his followers to support him as he raised his standards. Parliament raised their standard in London, and the English Civil War had begun. So that's the causes of the English Civil War: political, the power struggle between Charles and Parliament; religious, fears of Catholic influence and reforms; economic, with ship money; and military, with war with Scotland. The next video will cover the actual events and the significance of the English Civil War. See you then.